So you ever sit in class and listen to your professor lecture about some important or abstract idea, and because you're a fucking moron, you immediately connect it to something kind of dumb? And then maybe because I guess the universe still hasn't taught you your lesson and you are but a young and naive child with a heart full of hubris, you start to look into the two subjects you connected more and more, and because there is a quarantine-causing pandemic, not just devastating national governments and urban centers globally, but your own community and neighborhood, which could easily take months to heal from, months that you're gonna have to fill with something, any sort of activity just to feel alive, like a person with a brain and a body and creative potential and personal experiences. But you're just a college student, so outside of your non-essential job, your only real offerable skills are essay writing and sociological theory application and text analysis. So now, suddenly, you have the outline of a novella-length analysis of a single character from a decades-old video game franchise through the perspective of one of the most important and controversial Western writers in the post-World War II era, and then you find yourself reading the script to the first in a 3-part essay series on this incredibly specific, niche, and unimportant topic that your bored mind invented in the middle of an Introduction to Sociological Theories class. So this video is dedicated to the professor of that class. Part 1, an introduction to Post-Modernism. Modernism, as it is often referred to, roots back to the Great Enlightenment, in which, following the scientific development of the 16th and 17th century, understood as ending the Dark Ages, a period categorized by the rise of feudalism across Europe, an intellectual movement dissuading the classical, spiritual, and romantic justifications of such governance were rejected. As rapid improvements to science made questions and wonders that were once explained and delegated to the realm of heaven understandable and accessible to mere man, many of the cultural and political constructs that had relied on the innate ignorance of man in the face of the vastness of the universe to exist, or basically, a bunch of dudes realized that the Earth wasn't the fucking center of the universe, and they figured that, if the Earth isn't the center of the universe, then maybe the king isn't either. As autocrats lost more and more power to the rise of democracy, the humanist nature of electoral governments became synonymous with the implication of man's greater autonomy. If science granted man the potential to wield control over the physical world, then democracy granted man the potential to wield power over the social and political world. Ironically, just as autocrats had once justified their rule with the romanticism and spirituality of, often intentionally mistranslated and altered, religious text, the inhumane terrors of laissez-faire capitalism became justified as efficient, scientific, modern. This excuse would quickly become a brother to the same excuses that the Enlightenment movement had sought to counter. Modernism and traditionalism, or romanticism, or family values, are now used to counter not just the underlying beliefs or outcomes of these philosophies, but rather to reinforce them. A woman working 3 jobs to support her family and barely get by can either be lauded as a hero or a villain under both modernism or traditionalism interchangeably without the underlying social institutions that have supported and enabled this woman's circumstances ever having to be confronted, retorted, or even acknowledged. If you were ever wondering why there were so many feminist makeup commercials in the past decade, despite the industry undoubtedly standing as one of the most easily cited symbols of the institutionalization of women's oppression, this is why. As such, alongside the social critique that came to define the 1970s, a new theoretical school was developed to call out these practical inconsistencies. After all, if you and I are supposed to be complete opposites who never agree, but everything we do or say or propose elicits the same results, do we really disagree? This is the question that postmodernism implies. Postmodernism is less of a perspective in and of itself, and is instead a family of its own philosophical analyses and perspectives such as intersectionality or post-structuralism. Speaking of post-structuralism, Part 2, Foucault. Arguably one of the fathers of postmodernism, Michel Foucault was a noted French writer and structuralist, a mode of social analysis focused on the relationships between social institutions. However, Foucault would go on to actually become one of the first recognized post-structuralists, or deconstructualists, or postmodernists when he was brought on to the staff of an experimental university in Vincennes in 1968, who the French Ministry of Education deemed so radical as to revoke the university's accreditation altogether. While there, Foucault was known to frequently take part in protests side by side with his students, even fighting police. It wasn't until the mid-70s, however, until Foucault would really begin to establish the doctrines of deconstructionalism. So this is going to come off as a bit of a tangent, but before I really started studying sociology in college, I was actually in the physics department. And the funny thing I always tell people is that the textbooks for both of these classes have just as much shit to throw in the other. It might seem kind of obvious to most people by now, but hard sciences can be kind of snotty about their designation, although in the era of post-Elon Musk, it is kind of nice to see these people finally being told to shut the fuck up. But I do have a pet theory about why these two specific disciplines hate each other, despite both being perhaps the most theoretical and analytical of their binary designations. Like, physics is a lot of math, but you're not really doing a lot of, like, lab experiments. I mean, you know, you get your egg and you drop your egg and you weigh the egg and, you know, assuming that gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, then you can find, you know, the speed or whatever of the egg. But it's not like there's gravity juice that you're gonna be measuring, or like filter out of a river. You can do a lot with the speed of light and angles and circles and measure how big or far away a star is, but like, who's really gonna check? Is Miss Frizzle going to fucking take you to star FX3-0440 to check your fucking homework? Yeah. Exactly. There's a certain philosophy, a certain mindset, a certain culture to physics in which the bestest, most important theories are the ones that can be applied to the most broad and wide range of subjects as possible. And that's fine. It's great. That's just how it works, how it's done. This isn't my piping hot hashtag takedown to cancel Isaac Newton. However, distinct from other disciplines, sociology is very loud and proud about its distinctly opposite approach, referred to as mid-range theories. There's basically this exponential curve within the social sciences where once you get past either observed universal realities, the range of which your theories can be applied becomes extremely narrow. Or, to harp on another discipline, unlike philosophy, sociologists really care about not being wrong and looking like idiots years after their publications. Because of this, there's a sort of self-policing humility culture in sociology where you're generally expected to err on the side of caution, you know, try not to rock the boat too much, try not to make any wild claims of fact on the nature or development of major tenets of society and culture, or the scale of all people who have ever or will ever live. You know, like, maybe don't do something crazy, like trying to write an up-to-date history of the development and sociological and cultural implications and impact of all human sexuality. Don't do that one, maybe. Because, oh boy, did Foucault try. Well, that alone sounds pretty preposterous. Foucault has a distinct writing style in which many of his books are proclaimed to be a simple but deep dive analysis on a topic that would otherwise be pretty run-of-the-mill in terms of mid-range social theory. A book on law enforcement, on the implications of surviving reports of madness in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, an analysis on the historical connotations of the mid-20th century sexual revolution. However, when reading these books, you may hit a snag of interest. This is the book that redefined sociological analysis, This is the guy who kicked off the postmodern era? This is just a piece-by-piece analysis of historical events under a modern lens. Like, it's fine, for what it is. But how could this be... Oh... Because for all intent and purposes, the legacy of Foucault is not within the actual subjects his books were advertised as covering, but rather in their conclusions, which often make such mid-range theories as humans inherently cannot comprehend objective reality. All human authority is derived from our innate ability to and fear of murder. The Great Enlightenment, that, as was previously mentioned, fathered scientific reasoning, the Industrial Revolution, and modernism as a concept, was actually a ploy to degrade and discriminate against aneurotypical people and justify their removal from society. Yeah, that last one wasn't very popular. Did any of that make sense? I'm not really sure. I think writing the script has really helped me to understand Foucault better, because when you're tackling a topic that is so wide and expansive, especially one your intended audience is unlikely to be familiar with, it's really hard to do so without having some sort of grounding example, common experience, or historical event, or a piece of media that the audience could be easily presumed decently comfortable with, and that could help illustrate the points being made, not just to those who are familiar with the subject material, but to newcomers as well. Gee, if only there was a popular comic, or maybe a movie, or maybe a video game that is incredibly prominent in postmodernist themes. Maybe even a character with a lot of dialogue, or like a surrounding context and behavior that was really elicitative of Foucault. Even hard to understand Foucault, you know. Or efficiency. Part 3, Metal Gear. So, saying Metal Gear Solid has postmodernist themes is a little bit like saying the Star Wars sequels weren't very compelling, or like Night in the Woods has Marxist themes, or like Grand Theft Auto is a bit of the unwoke. There's plenty of analysis and deconstruction videos on a lot of the broader postmodern themes throughout the franchise, and several that specifically pick apart the postmodern theming of Metal Gear Solid 2. But I don't really want to play Metal Gear Solid 2, so this video isn't about that. That's not a dig on Metal Gear or Metal Gear Solid 2 or gamers. I'm just really bad at video games, and the house is under renovation, which has been slowed by Corona, so the PlayStation has been and is going to live in the home office for the foreseeable future, which is also being used more now because of Corona, and I'm only writing this video in the first place because the Corona cut my semester short, and if I don't write at least 2 overly long essays a month, I'm gonna die. Maybe I'll do a more focused video one day where I take a look at the subjects of this video and Metal Gear Solid 2 and where they intersect. Because while I think it strengthens the overall perspective at play here, I just do not find that one particular point very interesting. I don't really want to talk about it first, so we're just going to skip it. Go watch one of these videos and you'll get the gist of it anyway. End of tangent. Part 4, An Identity to Defeat Metal Gear. Metal Gear Solid, the franchise, not like the game, has a pretty bleak perspective on the nature of identity. While a symbolic interactionist like Goffman would claim that identity is the process and result of an individual expressing and negotiating their personal feelings in the context of their society and culture, Metal Gear Solid instead presents identity as a set of expectations and contexts that is ascribed to an individual by a higher, but distinctly human authority. For example, after the events of Snake Eater, Real Actual Person 1964 U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson declares that, since the formerly naked Snake successfully killed and, in a sense, defeated the boss, a woman who had similarly been granted her title as a signifier of a Goliathan strength and good soldiering, then it is only appropriate that Snake be given a new title and codename that signifies his accomplishment. Big Boss. And he fucking hates it.
Throughout the course of the next 2 chronological games in the franchise, the soldier formerly known as Naked Snake struggles not only to resist the new label, but also the expectations that the new role carries. He's not just a soldier codenamed Naked Snake, he's Big Boss, the soldier that surpassed the boss, who was once thought of as the greatest soldier who had ever lived. So now he's not just expected to be a good soldier, he's expected to be better than what was previously believed to be the best possible. But of course, nobody's perfect. After learning more about the boss's life and identity outside of her exploits as a soldier, the soldier formerly known as Naked Snake finds himself a mix of disgusted and betrayed when he learns she hasn't lived up to or embraced the tenets of what he believed should compose the perfect soldier, the soldier she supposedly was. In doing so, he does not just reject her personal autonomy in defining and expressing her own individual beliefs and values separate from the role of soldier, but in doing so, we, the audience, become painfully aware of just how much the soldier formerly known as Naked Snake has internalized the soldier identity that has been imposed upon him by real-life actual 1964 sitting United States of America President Lyndon B. Johnson. He may have formerly been known as Naked Snake, but he is now Big Boss.
Throughout the series, the majority of Metal Gear Solid characters are referred to not with names, but by monikers and code names that have been given to them by others.
There are a few exceptions, like Meryl Silversberg and Hellmaster McDonald Benedict Kazuhiro Miller, who has an overly long thematic baggage about his name that I'm not going to go into, but it's technically, it's not a codename, trust me, it's not a codename. But for the most part, people in Metal Gear are named like a Stanley Kubrick Toontown character. While this choice is a pretty on-the-nose metaphor for how almost none of the characters in Metal Gear have any control or autonomy over their lives, or even self-identities, down to their given name being composed of nothing more than random, impersonal phrases that, like a codec channel, are completely detached from the actual individual they are assigned to, and as such can easily be reassigned to another at the drop of a hat, I do think it is worth mentioning that the series' two main protagonists both divert from this convention. Otacon, the portmanteau of otaku and convention, is invented and self-assigned in Metal Gear Solid by Hal Emmerich, a man who was originally raised in the shadow and expectations of his distant and abusive father, Huey Emmerich. Side note, Hal is named not just as like a cute reference to the HAL 9000 because Kojima liked Kubrick movies, he is also named Hal in universe as a reference to HAL 9000 by his father because he saw the movie in canon and decided that would be a good basis for a baby name. Speaking from experience, I can confirm there is no greater way to guarantee that your child never uses their legal name than by naming them after a pop culture reference. While Solid Snake is similarly assigned a codename in reference to his clone father Big Boss, aka Naked Snake, by the end of Metal Gear Solid he is comfortable in adopting his previously lesser-used legal name David, and in Metal Gear Solid 2 expands the name to David Pliskin, ironically to avoid his identification as Solid Snake. You know, kind of like you'd use a codename for. Anyways, as memeable as some of the codenames in Metal Gear are, the distinctions aren't always so obvious. For example, the previously mentioned Huey Emmerich, while not ever actually assigned a codename, is actually a nickname given to him by the characteristically Kubrickian named mother of his child, Dr. Strangelove. Similarly, but not, the CIA director in Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater and later head of the Peace Watcher project in, well, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, goes by Hot Coldman. There is no indication that this isn't his legal name, that there isn't a birth certificate tucked away in some drawer somewhere marked Hot Coldman. We have to assume this is his name.
And then there's Adam. That's his name. Is it his code name or his real name? Yes. Yes.
5. Adam ruins everything. Adam, better known as Revolver Ocelot, is perhaps Metal Gear's best-known enigma. Closest to rivaling Solid Snake in terms of recognizability, Ocelot is easily one of the most beloved characters on the franchise, and there's good reason. Even if he technically isn't the main antagonist in Metal Gear, he is absolutely the most prominent. In a series where the player character isn't even consistent between games, Ocelot acts as a rock for gamers. If something is happening, you can bet Ocelot's involved. If one of the major through lines of Metal Gear Solid is the exploration of the restraints that assigned and perceived identities impose on individuals, then one of, if not the most prominent character motifs in the series is a dissatisfaction or struggle with said identities and limitations. Solid Snake doesn't like being a genetically manufactured soldier, Raiden doesn't like whatever the fuck his storyline was about, Eli doesn't like being treated like a child, Big Boss doesn't like being the supposed best soldier in the world, Meryl's not like other girls.
Now this might seem like a tangent, and also very dated, but I remember binge watching Tiger King and watching all the breakdown and discussion videos.
People talking about how no matter how funny or weird or passionate or insane any of these people seem, at the end of the day, what really matters is the well-being of those big cats. How big cats shouldn't have to be bred and live their lives in small cramped cages in Oklahoma or wherever. Cats don't want that. They want to be out in the wild, out in the savannah or jungle, and free to be themselves with no cages, no fences, no boundaries, just wide open horizon.
And you know what? That's a sentiment I can agree with. But at the same time, I know at least one cat who, quite frankly, loves his cage.
Part 6. The meow of a cat who has come to love his cage. What makes Ocelot so unique and distinct from the rest of the MGS cast is that while he is just as restrained and defined by his identity, life circumstances, and skill set as many of the other characters, Ocelot doesn't see this as a negative. Just look at him! While other characters are ruminating on the nature of inheritance, having deep philosophical discussions about the nature of freedom, or finding sympathy and solace in the shared traumas of equally broken men and women, Ocelot is just running around, meowing, being bisexual, juggling his guns, playing Red Dead Redemption 2, probably smoking crack, riding horses, eat chips, shooting guns, and lie, because hashtag
Looks
Fridays
like
for the
you
boys.
read them
Love
wrong.
living in the battlefield? How about loving the battlefield? Real, authentic, Wild West feelings. No naked cause, no feeling like sliding a bullet down a well-oiled chamber. Am I right, fellas?
Good.
Well, not only does this make Ocelot an amazing foil to Solid Snake and Otacon, but it also makes him an incredibly effective tension relief character in all of his appearances. Most of the time, this narrative function would be filled by a character who makes well-timed jokes, a comic relief character, and there's no denying that Ocelot is funny, but the genius of his character is that Ocelot doesn't have to be particularly funny in any given moment. He just needs to be the guy who shows up and is content with his lot in life. While Metal Gear is partially as beloved as it is for its strong emotional and dark moments, I think that because Ocelot is the only primary character that serves this function is the reason that Ocelot is as popular as he is. Without other characters to carry the burden of, everything is fine, this is exactly what I want, dog, Ocelot, in comparison to other characters, becomes perceived as incredibly laid-back and positive. Even if in the end we're happy that he loses, we're glad he had a good time winning. But not really. A little while ago, Ian of Innuendo Studios analyzed the premise of Dr. Horrible's sing-along log, in which he covers the idea that the typical superhero narrative centers on a protagonist who accidentally has power bestowed onto them, which they then struggle to rectify the responsibility and life changes the power brings, while the antagonist actively seeks power, has less power than the protagonist, and as such struggles against the protagonist to gain more power.
This dynamic isn't exclusive to the superhero genre, and is sometimes referred to as the reactive protagonist model, in which the narrative momentum actually comes from the villain of the story instead of the main character. Classically, the terms protagonist and antagonist were used to better define these roles, in which the protagonist was the character with the central motivation from which the primary narrative would grow around, and the antagonist served as the central obstacle to the protagonist's quest to achieve their motivation. However, in stories where the main character works to protect some status quo, such as the classic children's cartoon G.I. Joe, for example, or defend themselves from an outside threat, the roles are reversed, as it is now the villain or antagonist in the modern sense, whose motivations dictate the story, and the hero or protagonist who must resist them.
A lot of crime or monster of the week stories are built around this dynamic, in which the criminal or monster wants to bring havoc, and the main characters want to stop them. When we take a step back and look at Metal Gear as a whole, Ocelot is actually one of the most proactive characters in the series, if not the most proactive primary character. This is notable because as a proactive villain, we would expect Ocelot to amass power throughout the chronological portion of the series with Solid Snake at the helm. However, the most significant changes in Ocelot's role to the grander narrative happen in hindsight. It's not that between his introduction in Metal Gear Solid 1 and his death in Metal Gear Solid 4, Ocelot becomes involved in the global unification conspiracy. It's just that Solid Snake and the audience now knows about it. Take this in contrast with, say, a Mario game. Any Mario game. The formula is pretty consistent, with the games being divided into a series of worlds, those worlds being devised into a series of levels, and the last level being some sort of fortress owned by Bowser, where Mario is to presume Princess Peach is held, to avoid monotony, and to aid in the narrative build of anticipation and suspense. The very last castle in the game, where Princess Peach is actually kept, is the largest, longest, and toughest of these fortress levels in the game, and oftentimes the fortress between the castle at the end of the world and the castle at the end of the last world just get progressively larger and more complex as to build up this final encounter. This design function doesn't just hold the player's investment in terms of Gladwellian progression, in which the longer the player plays the game, the better at the game they become and the more complexity and difficulty they will require from the game to hold their interest, but also serves a very basic mode of investment validation for the player. The game doesn't try to hide that it's progressively getting more difficult, and the castle layers serve as an indicator or a way to measure the progress of the player. The castle levels in Mario are the game's way of saying, remember how challenging the last castle was all those levels ago? Well, look at how much more challenging this new castle is. Wow, you and Mario sure have gotten good at this whole hero plumber thing. It's the game attempting to both validate and encourage the player's own ego while also deriving as much investment and satisfaction from the game's incredibly thin narrative. After all, the final confrontation wouldn't feel nearly as rewarding if we didn't watch Mario struggle against and overcome all these lesser obstacles.
But Ocelot is never presented as the greatest obstacle in Snake's mission. He isn't even the main antagonist, he's just the most recognizable antagonist and therefore the one that Solid Snake and the player form the greatest animosity and parasocial relationship with.
Although, Kojima really wants the subject of the relationship to be the character Solid Snake unceremoniously immediately kills a Metal Gear Solid. Sorry, pal.
Animosity and parasocial relationship with. The point in all of this is that despite all of the triple crossing and conspiracies, all of the doublethink and legwork and ulterior motives, Revolver Ocelot never seems to reap any of the benefit from his greater achievement.
It's like if despite absolutely bodying the consumer market across nearly all industries and owning a trillion-dollar company, Jeff Bezos lived in a cardboard box. Like, you should be the richest man on Earth. Where are your profits? Interestingly, we see Ocelot experience something incredibly similar, wherein after the events of Snake Eater, Ocelot briefly becomes the richest man in the world after acquiring the Philosopher's Legacy, an incredible amount of money that previously funded an Illuminati-esque global conspiracy's shadow government. Despite the power this wealth once wielded, after all it was grand enough to fund an entire organization's progressive takeover of the entire world, just imagine what an individual could do with that money, concentrated into ownership in a single party rather than divided among various benefactors, organizations, operations, bribes, expensive employees. Did the philosophers have employees? I mean, someone's gotta be taking the phone calls, mopping floors, feeding the child soldiers, and I imagine they wouldn't be doing it for any greater ideological or political fulfillment. So I'm just going to assume that the philosophers had employees that were, paid. After all, in 2017, Apple became the first trillion-dollar company, but Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, is only worth about $625 million. Even Jeff Bezos, Amazon's founder and projected to become the first private trillionaire by 2026, is just currently worth $146.9 billion. I say this not to undermine the absurd wealth these bloodsuckers have amassed, but merely to demonstrate the difference in scope between corporate and private finances, which only serves to highlight the sheer volume of wealth that Ocelot, the single human man, would have received. And he gives it away.
You see, after receiving all of the money in the world, Ocelot demonstrates the power that said wealth wields, withholding it from the original Illuminati-esque conspiracy that had amassed it, causing the Cold War spanning shadow government to completely collapse overnight.
After potentially becoming the singularly most influential person in the Metal Gear's versus modern age, this guy comes up to Ocelot and says, "Huh, wow man, that shadow government shit sure was fucked up, right? Haha, like, wow, way to invade my cultural and political sovereignty and invalidate my individual autonomy. Anyways, the Cold War is fucking bullshit. If only there was some institution large enough to encapsulate both the United States and the USSR, you know, like, from the shadows, sure would be cool. Hey, wouldn't it be cool if you gave me all that money so that I could start my own world-encapsulating shadow government? It's definitely what your dead mom, who we will never explicitly confirm that you knew or not, would have wanted." And then he fucking does it. The mad latitude of it all.
So this video is already insanely long, and I'm going to try and cover this point and the events, consequences, and implications of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater at another time, but let me just go ahead and say that Ocelot will never benefit from this decision. The event cascades a wider pattern throughout the Metal Gear franchise in which, despite his pride and disregard for others, Ocelot never centers his plans around himself or his best interest.
Typically in action stories with the scale of Metal Gear, the hero is poised as some sort of stand-in for egalitarianism. They usually have what loved ones they care about, or a community they're trying to protect, and in that drive to protect and help others broadens to wider and wider demographics. Luke Skywalker starts off as a kind of whiny, selfish, but understandable brat who wants to leave the family farm, where his work is presumably relied on so that he can go to flight school and come into his own as a strong, adventure-seeking, and independent young man. Then the Empire attacks his family. He is ready to seek out revenge and learns more of the injustices that the Empire have imposed on countless young men and families across the universe. And now Luke is no longer fighting for his freedom or for revenge for his family. He is fighting for the freedom of everyone in the galaxy and in revenge for all the lives the Empire has slaughtered. Not all stories in the action and adventure genres follow this format, and this narrative format isn't even exclusive to these types of stories. Hairspray, the John Waters film, stage musical adaptation and 2007 remake of the stage show, tell the story of Tracy Turnbull, an overweight schoolgirl who, in her fight to star on a local TV dance show, comes not just to fight for her dancing skills to be recognized and showcased, but also for the integration as she learns that the black performers who are just as talented, if not more so, than the white performers on the show have been kept from performing because of their race, similarly to how Tracy has been kept off of the show because her weight means she doesn't fit the show's aesthetic. This is a bit of a side note, but I really appreciate how this point is highlighted by the black dancers being led and represented by Motormouth Maybelle, a woman who is both black and overweight, since it better frames the dilemma of the Corny Collins show, not allowing dancers who don't fit a superficial and narrow expectations of identity and appearance from performing, rather than accidentally equating being white and overweight with racism and segregation.
So while it is common for heroic characters to find their motivation to save humanity in their growing empathy, compassion, and selflessness, villains, serving as foils to these heroes, usually find their motivation fueled by their disregard for others in their own path for self-service.
Scar kills Mufasa because he wants to be king. Anakin Skywalker wants to save Padme and is willing to become a Sith if it gives him the power to do so. Bowser does not respect Princess Peach's autonomy as a strong independent woman, etc., etc. While Solid Snake does absolutely come to represent this selfless hero ready to dedicate and potentially even sacrifice his life to keep the rest of humanity safe, and Ocelot is absolutely a prideful fuck who lacks concern for the well-being of others, he isn't really self-serving. Throughout the Metal Gear Solid franchise, all of Revolver Ocelot's confusing plans and misdirections can be tied back to Big Boss, the real antagonist in Metal Gear. Now, Metal Gear certainly isn't the only franchise to give their antagonist a minion or a boss that the protagonist eventually has to deal with, but usually with these relationships, the smaller antagonist will have some sort of motivation to comply with the larger antagonist. Scar promises to feed the hyenas if he becomes king, Palpatine promises he can teach Anakin how to save Padme, Bowser is Bowser Jr.'s dad?
Well, for all the work Ocelot does, he must have some really strong motivation to work under Big Boss, considering it is him and not Ocelot who was supposed to benefit from all of these shenanigans. He must have offered Ocelot something he really wanted, or threatened him with something really, really bad. I mean, Why else would you go to so much effort, sacrifice so much of your life to complete someone else's project? Even if you believe in the project, how could you possibly give so much of yourself to someone or something only to never benefit and constantly put yourself in danger?
Surely Ocelot has to be getting something out of this. Right? Part 7. Kept you waiting, huh? In Truth and Power, Foucault famously makes the leap from structuralism to post-structuralism by relaying how it is that language may not just exist as a medium of expression, but that by doing so, it is actually language itself that serves to define the parameters in how one expresses themselves.
While structuralism discusses how language is utilized to convey and express ideas that presumably exist outside of language itself, with language merely the medium for how these independent ideas are communicated, however, post-structuralists, like Foucault, offer that without languages, thoughts don't have a method to exist. So, remember when Facebook just had likes?
And there were all these jokes and memes about, like, the optics of liking a post about someone grieving the death of their dog, or like a news article about starving children. And there were all of these memes and jokes for years about how Facebook needed a dislike button to fight against all of the annoying Jersey Shore drama or whatever the fuck people were posting about in 2012. But then in 2016, Facebook didn't add a dislike button.
Instead, Facebook expanded the like feature to include love, haha, wow, sad, and angry. I really don't appreciate the inconsistency in the grammar of Facebook reactions. Oh, yeah, man, I really ha-ha'd it. This reaction expansion recontextualized how people interact with and share Facebook posts. While previously a like was a vague acknowledgement, if not condoning of the post, the introduction of new reactions and the differentiation between them now defines likes as a form of underwhelmed support, a kind of, yeah. Because if you are liking a post, you didn't love it. The post didn't wow you, or make you sad, or angry, or ha-ha. But the post still made enough of an impression for you to still interact with it. Thus is post-structuralism, because even when people were expressing that the Facebook like system was too narrow a mode of post-interaction and personal expression, the dominant suggestions and alternatives offered to counter the problem were still very much confined to the original language of the Facebook like. Because if you like some things, that must suggest that you dislike other things. The presence of the like implies a binary of like and dislike, like we see on current day YouTube. But it doesn't inherently imply the possibility of a sad, or a wow, or an angry. Plague Dogs is an incredibly sad movie, but I still like it. Hell, I love it. Even though, let's be honest, a lot of the memes about Facebook adding a dislike button were under the pretense that it would serve basically the same function that the angry button currently does. This contrast between old Facebook and new Facebook, and the consensuses around them, highlights not just the importance of language and communication, but also how language shapes our reality, and how the availability of concepts is consequentially related to the availability of language. Importantly, Foucault and other post-structuralists emphasize how this dynamic can extend past explicit language and into all fields of knowledge, such as identity.
Part 8. The Punishing of the Snake. After the events of Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, but before the events of Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, Big Boss gets knocked into a deep coma and Zero, this is Zero, decides that Big Boss has become too public of a figure and has become too much of a liability for his plans and his own safety, and approaches Ocelot and is like, "Hey, remember when you gave me all that money? What if we made a second Big Boss? I mean, we got this half-dead guy lying around." And again, Ocelot accepts. Using hypnosis and his normal, very healthy, and very heterosexual knowledge of Big Boss, Ocelot is able to present all of Big Boss's thoughts, memories, and opinions to the man as his own, creating Venom Snake. Ocelot then saves Venom Snake and brings him out to Mother Base, where Ocelot and Kazuhiro Miller have based Big Boss's new private mercenary army, the Diamond Dogs. Through the hypnotherapy and plastic surgery, Venom Snake passes easily for Big Boss, both to the rest of the world, to the Diamond Dogs, and to Venom Snake himself. By doing so, Ocelot doesn't just control what Venom Snake, Kazuhiro Miller, and the Diamond Dogs believe, but he in essence makes this belief into reality. Because everyone believes that Venom Snake is Big Boss, including Venom Snake, and Ocelot prevents ulterior information from being presented or considered, the belief that Venom Snake is Big Boss goes unchallenged. In doing so, Ocelot presents a narrative that becomes adopted and internalized by the consensus.
As outlined in Foucault's Knowledge and Power, knowledge is not a series of facts, but rather knowledge is the process by which power is hidden from the public.
Kazuhiro Miller doesn't just believe that Venom Snake is Big Boss because Revolver Ocelot tells him he is. He's a big boy. He's not just going to believe whatever is told to him, but he knows that Venom Snake is Big Boss because it fits the narrative that Kazuhiro and the rest of the Diamond Dogs, including Venom Snake himself, believe. The narrative that has been constructed, as you may have guessed, by Ocelot. Part of the genius of Ocelot's Plan in 5 is the hypnosis of Venom Snake. You may have heard the saying, "The secret to a good lie is believing in the lie," and this is demonstrated in spades in MGS 5. According to Ocelot, Big Boss has woken up from a 9-year coma, and out of his loyalty and dedication to his men, he has immediately come out to Mother Base to be reunited with his troops so that they can follow in Miller's plan to seek revenge on Cypher for the destruction of MSF. What makes the V lie so believable isn't just that Venom Snake believes that he is Big Boss, but that the proponents around the lie, the rest of the narrative that Ocelot has constructed, are congruent with the narrative about Big Boss that previously existed. That Big Boss is this unstoppable, impenetrable soldier, one who is always extremely loyal and dedicated not just to his men, but to the liberation of all soldiers. Of course he'd come back out to Mother Base. He cares about his men. He cares and missed his platonic heterosexual war-feeling partner, Kazuhiro Miller. Why wouldn't he come back? Kazuhiro Miller was always involved in Big Boss's plans in MSF. They told each other everything. In this narrative that Kazuhiro Miller believes and has taught to the rest of the Diamond Dogs, Big Boss would never lie to him. So Venom tells him that he hasn't.
However, as suggested by Foucault, knowledge goes further than what people believe.
Knowledge is inherently a matter of power dynamics, as what is and is not accepted as knowledge is dependent upon the narratives that have been previously accepted and established by people of power and influence, and on the motivation of those currently in or seeking power. While it was originally Zero who had the Venom Snake plan, Big Boss did wake up from his coma, and he did support the plan, specifically so Venom could go deal with his bitchy husband, while the real Big Boss could focus his attention on establishing Outer Heaven, his independent nation for soldiers. As Cause and Venom accept and internalize this narrative, they realize the narrative through their actions, behaving in ways cognizant of this narrative being correct. Changing the information that Cause and V both have access to and are to believe as fact, Ocelot is able to preemptively take control of Cause and Venom's behavior. In doing so, events transpire as they would if Venom Snake really was Big Boss, up until the revelation at the end of MGS 5, in which Cause finally learns of the divorce papers Big Boss had actually filed months ago, annulling their military marriage and granting him sole custody of Solid Snake. However, as Venom Snake is playing the role of Big Boss on Mother Base, saying all of the things that Big Boss would say, eating all of the food that Big Boss would eat, completing missions as effortlessly as Big Boss would, Big Boss is still conducting his own work on Outer Heaven in South Africa.
This construction of narratives, of providing ideas that are compatible with pre-existing beliefs and biases, is actually the same strategy utilized by a lot of propaganda,
in which a false premise or misleading perspective on events is intentionally presented as to recontextualize an otherwise fringe or unfound belief or course of action as justifiable. It's dangerous to vaccinate children because vaccines actually contain autism, the tangible compound apparently. Women can't be legally guaranteed equal pay and constitutional protections because it'll make them all lesbians, and then humanity will go extinct because there won't be any more heterosexuals to reproduce. The coronavirus is fake because it was concocted in a secret Chinese government lab to launch a bioterrorist attack on Americans, which is exactly why we need to reopen the country, and doesn't actually make a stronger argument for quarantine or the dangerous nature of the virus, because those blasted Chinese scientists bioengineered the virus to both smell fear and not exist at all, maybe. As cause and venom both hold significant influence and power over the army, since, you know, it's their fucking army. The narrative becomes accepted by others who looked at these two as authority figures. I mean, look at this guy. He acts like Big Boss, talks like Big Boss, has Big Boss's memories, tells people he's Big Boss. Why wouldn't the average person believe that this is Big Boss? After all, he is speaking on behalf of himself, and as the saying goes, nobody knows you better than you. Right? This is where the second half of Ocelot's deception comes into play, because for all of Ocelot's manipulation tactics and lies, taking over the narrative of Big Boss's identity, tricking his colleagues in the world over, changing what people ostensibly understand as fact and fiction, they aren't for his own benefit. Ocelot does not interfere with and overwrite the Diamond Dogs and global consensus on the location and identity of Big Boss so that he can build and impose his own power and influence over people. No. You see, while a knowledge vacuum would have naturally allowed Ocelot to gain an edge over the other members of Mother Base, this was never Ocelot's plan at all, because he forces himself to accept the exact same narrative.
Can you keep it up? It's a hell of a lie. It won't be a lie. I won't know his secret either. I'll believe that he's the real Big Boss. I'll have no conscious knowledge of you. Where's the lie in that? Self-hypnosis. It's nothing new in my line of work. Manipulating memories, the past. But that's not all. When the time is right, I need to remember that you're the real boss. In a world, it's double-think.
By knowingly subjecting himself to the internalization of an inorganically constructed narrative, including himself in this narrative instead of managing it at a distance, Ocelot forgoes a majority of the power he could have claimed over the and cause, and instead passes it on to
John, the real Big Boss. While the legwork was inarguably done by Ocelot, the narrative that he actually constructed, the one that Venom is the real Big Boss, that his memories seem foggy and strange as an effect of his 9-year coma, and not instead symptomatic of the intense psychological conditioning that Ocelot has administered on him, Ocelot is not the party who reaps the power that this crafted discontinuity makes room for. Instead, the narrative is crafted explicitly to ensure that John, Big Boss, both maintains and accumulates power and influence over all of the parties. Ocelot, in his self-hypnosis, doesn't just cage himself to this false narrative, but expresses an uncomfortable and almost perverse enjoyment in doing so. This isn't just a bird who has learned to love his own cage, but rather one that insists on building a smaller one for the convenience of his own master.
Obviously, Ocelot would be in a strategically much more powerful spot if he hadn't chosen to hypnotize himself as well. But it is this added layer that really solidifies his plan.
If Ocelot doesn't know that Venom is not the real Big Boss, there is no possibility for Ocelot to behave in any way that would contradict this narrative. It's like when people go on diets and throw out all the food they have that they shouldn't eat. It is easier to rely on the constraints of reality than on the individual's self-control.
If there's no junk food in your kitchen, and you don't bring any junk food into the kitchen, then it's impossible for you to eat junk food and ruin your diet. Similarly, without Ocelot even suspecting that Venom Snake is not Big Boss, and with nobody else on Mother Base or in Cypher having the access to any information that contradicts this narrative, the narrative that Venom Snake simply is Big Boss becomes a self-contained narrative, one that justifies its own existence and adherence by simple lack of challenge.
After all, without any information to challenge the notion that Venom Snake is Big Boss, there is no remaining option for anyone on Mother Base than to accept, to believe, to know that Venom Snake is Big Boss. Part 9. The Discourse. As I have previously alluded to, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, and in turn, Revolver Ocelot, imply that the identity of Big Boss is less reliant on any objective reality than it is on what the common perception is. In Foucaultian terms, this idea is referred to as discourse, in which knowledge is crafted not off of an independent and quantifiable set of facts, but instead through social practices, shared subjectivity, and power relations. Often the greatest critiques of Foucaultian thought and postmodernism as a whole is the camp's ignorance or discreditation of objective reality. However, this is a matter of perspective.
You see, while there are camps of postmodern thought that tend towards more of an abstract notion of reality, a la Descartes, Foucault and deconstructionalists merely acknowledge that there is no way for humans to perceive knowledge or information outside of the context of the human experience, that all beliefs and perspectives will always be filtered through these biases. A good way of demonstrating this idea is to take a look at how humans perceive light in comparison to other animals. For example, many species of birds don't just see the same light in colors that people can, but also UV light as well. So that raises the question:
what color? While we see the beaks of puffins as red and orange, and the wings of owls brown and gray, under blacklight we can see that these beaks and feathers glow blue and pink respectively.
We know that birds likely perceive how light reflects on the bodies of other birds differently than we do, but birds don't participate in society. They don't communicate with us like people communicate amongst themselves. For most people, it really doesn't matter if birds see themselves differently than as we do or not. After all, if I were to say puffins had orange beaks, what would the puffins even do? Correct me? Subtweet me? Am I going to be canceled for assigning a color to a bird? Birds don't have influence over how we choose to use language or describe their appearances. And we know we can only perceive a small segment of the range of light wave frequencies, but that doesn't really matter. Because not being able to see light waves outside of the visible spectrum is universal. And humans only write books and have conversations for and with other humans. So who cares what color birds perceive themselves as? We're going to describe them within the parameters of light wavelengths perceptible to us, because we don't write books for birds. We write them for other humans. We only discovered that birds could see UV light in the 1980s, and it is incredibly likely that plenty of birds could see UV light just fine before then too. But we didn't know, because we are not birds. We can't talk to birds, we can't ask birds questions about themselves, and we can't look through the eyes and compare their vision one-to-one with us. This is the dynamic that postmodernism emphasizes, that objective reality may exist, can exist, probably does exist, but that there is no knowledge that humans can manifest that will be immune to the inherent biases and limitations of human existence. That is discourse. We perceive the colors of birds one way, birds perceive the colors of other birds differently than humans do. But because humans have more social power, because we are talking about human society and not bird society, it is more appropriate, more truthful to say that puffins have orange beaks than it is to say that puffins have blue glowing beaks.
And this is exactly how Revolver Ocelot convinces everyone that Venom Snake is a big boss. But in this metaphor, Ocelot is a bird. He has the fourth color cone and could potentially see the UV light that differentiates Venom Snake from Big Boss, but he suppresses it. Hot glued special human vision sunglasses that suppress his ability to see UV light and hypnotizes himself to forget that he could ever see UV light and that UV light ever existed in the first place. Part 10, Self-Himbofication.
So now it's time, in this way too long video, to finally address the Ocelot in the room. Why?
Ocelot's a trained professional spy and interrogator. We've seen other characters in the Metal Gear franchise successfully keep up false narratives and lies without the aid of drug-induced hypnosis. And besides, not knowing that Venom Snake is Big Boss places him at a significant disadvantage, as without the knowledge of the discourse outside of the narrative, Ocelot confines himself only to work and scramble for power within it. He spends like the whole game fighting with Gauze over stupid bullshit. Like, dude, you fucking hold this man's reality in the palm of your hand. What the fuck is this nonsense? At first glance, Ocelot's behavior seems totally at odds with a Foucaultian perspective. After all, if the accumulation of power and knowledge and the definition of what is and what is not knowledge are conjoined, and Ocelot is intentionally trying to manipulate the situation to serve a greater purpose, why would he intentionally reduce the knowledge of which he has access to? Unless he just has some extreme fucking himbofication fetish, why would Ocelot possibly want to forgo his own power over the situation in MGS5?
Well, to answer that, we have to answer why people willingly submit to power in the first place, which Foucault does cover in Truth and Power.
Despite all the trickery, manipulation, and deceit, there are still scenarios in which people will consent to governance. Power is not inherently an immoral and evil concept. People like it? Not all the time, but power in a vacuum is definitely not a black and white concept. It should also come without saying that for one to have power over another person, Person A, the person in power, must have more power over Person B in their relationship, and Person B must therefore have less power in that relationship. Now, let's briefly apply this model to Ocelot to get better visuals on the dynamics at play here. When Big Boss and Ocelot first discussed their plans to craft and plant Venom as a false Big Boss to lead the Diamond Dogs, Big Boss and Ocelot have an enormous amount of power over the rest of the Diamond Dogs, who are completely ignorant to the inorganic nature of this perceived reality, and how Big Boss and Ocelot are pulling their strings just behind the curtain. However, we can also see from the start that Big Boss and Ocelot's relationship is not one of equal, and Big Boss has demonstrable power over Ocelot that has been derived over the years stemming from their alleviated rivalry alongside John's rise as Big Boss. Despite their newfound allyship, Big Boss still holds a notable foothold over Ocelot. And yet, Ocelot still seeks to increase the power gap, both in the long term by helping Big Boss accumulate more power globally, but also by reducing Ocelot's own influence. While the Venom plan only accounts for Ocelot temporarily having his power over the Diamond Dogs reduced to the same level as Kazuhira Miller's, Ocelot's motivation to do so is confounding. After all, why would Ocelot seek to have an even more imbalanced relationship with Big Boss and an even tighter rivalry with Kazuhira Miller, especially when, if Ocelot merely wanted to consent to Big Boss's governance, they were already more than apt to adopt that dynamic, if not arguably having done so as well. As explained by Foucault, what makes power hold good, what makes it accepted, is simply the fact that it doesn't weigh on us as a force that says no, but that it transverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms knowledge, produces discourse. It needs to be considered as a productive network which runs through the whole social body, much more than as a negative instance whose function is repression. Foucault, Truth and Power, 119. It is easy to grant another power over yourself because it costs nothing, allows for greater organization and specialization, and relieves individuals of stress and responsibility.
This might sound like a #liberal snowflake argument, but it is genuinely true that most people and civilizations benefit from some sort of system of authority and organization. Instead of everyone responsible for their own food, a certain portion of the population is responsible for the food for everyone. And other segments of the population become responsible for other necessary tasks that allow for the first segment to dedicate a greater amount of their time and labor to food production, etc., etc. Then, how does Ocelot benefit from having Big Boss hold so much power over him? What is it that motivates Ocelot to work to increase not just Big Boss's overall global power and influence, but to go so far as to reduce his own global power and influence, even temporarily, to increase the amount of power Big Boss specifically holds over Ocelot? Now hold on, I know what you're gonna say.
But if the mother-base narrative of Venom Snake's identity is self-contained, why would Ocelot believing in it increase the amount of power Big Boss wields over him? Shouldn't Big Boss's influence be irrelevant? Because even if Ocelot and the rest of Mother Base don't know that Big Boss is still out there, Big Boss knows exactly where they are and what they are doing. And as we have already established, knowledge is power. Part 11, House Cat. So if we understand the mechanics, the what and how of Ocelot and Big Boss's relationship dynamics, and the internalization of Venom Snake as Big Boss, we still need to understand the why. If we know in general terms why people under deconstructionism accept power, why is Ocelot so eager to help Big Boss accumulate more and more influence over not just others, but himself?
After all, we genuinely think of independence and autonomy, the power we have over ourselves and our lives, in high regard. And we have established that to consent to increasing third-party governance is to willingly reduce and restrict our own independent power and autonomy. We can only really understand such behavior as self-detrimental, unnecessary self-flagellation, that, like most unusual behavior, we find easiest to write off as a weird sex thing. But of course, the truth is always more complicated.
Forced research? That's not very different from what we do here. Diamond Dogs is different. Everyone here believes in you. Regardless of where they came from or why they're here, they revere you. And they're fighting because it was their choice. And if it wasn't, they'd leave? Who knows? That's our reality here, whether it's real or not. If there's another truth, I don't want to know it.
That's our reality here, whether it's real or not. There's another truth. I don't want to know it. And there it is, the line that inspired the whole video in the first place. By sacrificing his intellectual autonomy to Big Boss, Ocelot sacrifices his place in the discourse. His experiences don't matter. His perception of reality doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he believes or wants or thinks. All that matters is what Big Boss tells him. The only narrative that matters is the one Big Boss constructs, or the narrative that amasses the most power to Big Boss. And if there's another narrative, another discourse, another reality, Ocelot doesn't want to know it. That is a lot to unpack. In his current narrative, everyone is perfectly loyal to Big Boss. Big Boss is completely deserving of that loyalty, and nothing else matters. Not anyone's personal and individual experiences, thoughts, or behaviors that are not directly connected to their loyalty to Big Boss. And that includes Ocelot. And Ocelot doesn't want to know any alternative. He doesn't even really want to conceptualize or contemplate it. Because if Ocelot matters, like as an individual adult man, his behavior matters. And if Ocelot's behavior matters, then he can be held responsible for it.
Hey, I changed outfits. Don't worry about it. As explained by Foucault, submitting to power and authority are attractive to people because it alleviates them of the day-to-day responsibilities that, without such social organizations, are essential to the survival of all individuals. If nobody has the power to say who hunts and forages for food every day, then everybody has to hunt and forage for their own food and find their own water and build their own shelter and sew their own clothing and tend to their own ailments, and so on, which leaves virtually no time left for the higher pursuits of engineering, research, education, trade, and the arts. But clearly there's a huge difference between saying, I will listen to the rules that our leader has declared because in exchange they will keep me fed and safe and warm, and saying literally the only thing in the universe that matters is what the leader says and my unyielding loyalty and devotion to them. By rescinding nearly all of his intellectual autonomy to Big Boss, Ocelot also rescinds all of the responsibilities and burdens that said autonomy brings. Nothing in the world is free, and the cost of independent thought is the maintenance or general mental health and the consequence of those thoughts.
Which, under the narrative of the Diamond Dogs army, Ocelot is no longer responsible for. It doesn't matter if Ocelot likes to torture children, because he does so in the name of Big Boss, who is the sole authority over if Ocelot's actions are justifiable or not. The only accusations Ocelot could possibly be held to by a third party would be accusations of treason against Big Boss. But that's absurd, because nobody is more loyal to Big Boss than Ocelot is. Certainly, nobody in the Diamond Dogs at least, because despite the old adage, Ocelot is not a dog. He's a house cat. Big Boss's pet. He isn't responsible for his own well-being, his actions, his behavior. He isn't capable of independent thought, and he doesn't have to worry about the morality or consequences of his actions, only that he does so in the name of Big Boss, because whether or not he actually does, Ocelot knows Big Boss will provide for him. Because even if he doesn't, Ocelot wouldn't know. Because only Big Boss can know what Ocelot needs, and when those needs are being met. Because Ocelot isn't his conspiratorial partner, Ocelot is his house cat. Part 12, Conclusion.
This video is really fucking long. Now I know Ocelot is mentally a house cat is a really tough sell as a hashtag game theory, and there is certainly other questions that I didn't address in this video, as well as other points that could use more supporting evidence. Like, okay, Ocelot wants to mentally be a house cat. He wants to give up the responsibility of maintaining mental cohesion. Why would he want that? Could there be some set of events or tangential information in the Metal Gear text that adheres surprisingly close to any of Foucault's other literature that could possibly provide illumination on this point? Short answer, yes. Long answer, you're just gonna have to subscribe and wait to see my next video. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. I know this video was kind of long and seemingly came out of nowhere. You know, since it's quarantine and we're all looking for something to do, I thought this would be a nice way for me to both pass the time and kind of stick to a semi-academic, semi-professional schedule, you know, a reason for me to still like get up and get dressed and do my morning routine and then sit down and work for a few hours and then stop working and make dinner, that type of stuff. You know, the rest of this video is scripted, but I kind of wanted to do more a more improvised ending here. I've kind of wanted to do a video essay on this topic for a while, and I'm glad I've found the time here to do it. Like I've mentioned a couple other times in the video, I have plans for at least 2 more parts to this discussion, and I'm hoping that those other 2 parts can be a little shorter than this video and can come out a little bit faster, both because in the process of making this video I've learned more about how to write, edit, and produce these types of videos, but also if we think about this as, you know, all 3 of these parts as one consecutive essay, this video was kind of my introduction and my first body argument. While I think the next 2 are just going to be the body argument, since I'm not going to have to reintroduce Foucault and Post-Modernism and what Metal Gear is and why we're talking about it, which took up a pretty large section of this video. I also want to try and make some videos that are on kind of lighter topics that'll be a little bit shorter. At the time of recording this, getting up to this point in the video production took about less than 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, because I took a couple days off due to some issues with, you know, the power going out due to some pretty bad weather. And considering just the sheer length of this video, I think that's a pretty good timetable for me to have gotten this far in production, given I really don't have any experience doing this. So I'm hoping that I can maybe get something out every couple of weeks, something that's a little more standard for these types of channels, something, you know, about 20 to 30 minutes long every week, every other week. Patreon linked down in the description below. Comment and give me feedback on what you want to see on the Patreon as far as rewards go. Obviously I'm gonna have a tier in there for, you know, shout out during the credits, might get something in there for art commission or a shout out, some sort of personal email, I don't know yet. I mean, it'll all be down, you'll see that. Consider donating for one time on Ko-fi. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm probably gonna regret putting my Twitter in the description, but go ahead. subscribe, ring the bell, see the next time I do one of these, which should hopefully be in a couple of weeks here. But yeah, I want to give a shout out to the Metal Gear Solid fan wiki for having so much raw transcripts from cutscenes and codecs in the games. It really saved me a lot of time. I didn't have to just sit down and watch hours and hours and hours of Let's Plays to find specific quotes I was looking for. I was really able to just go in and, you know, look at different game transcripts and do Control F to find what I was looking for specifically. So that was very helpful. But yeah, I think that's it. Bye.